Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Dr. Jack Padantin. I am the president of Pacific Oaks College and Children's School. And I am overly excited to welcome you to Pacific Oaks today. Thank you so much for your interest, and thank you so much for you wanting to be part of this. You wanted to be part of this important event and wanted to actually use education to actually being a vehicle to fight against racism through anti-bias curriculum program. So I could not be more proud. I know your 3 hours is gonna be so well spent. And I know that you would learn to have tactics and tools to take back to your classroom, and that including the parents that are joining us today as well. Pacific Oaks is celebrating our 75th anniversary. We have been educating young children and college students for a long time. Our education is progressive, our core value based on social justice. And we create this kind of opportunity to make positive impact to our community. There are more to come, and I invite you to join the upcoming events. Most importantly, I invite you to be partner with Pacific Oaks to really better our community and to fight against racism and biases. So together we would do a much better impact. I hope that you would continue to keep up with information that we put out to the community. Education is important, and we are in this together to make a better world. Thank you so much. Let me pass it back to Dr. Donald Grant.
Greetings, everyone. Greetings, everyone. We're so happy that you are all here today to participate in this discussion on anti-bias programming. It's really important when we look at the dismantling of systemic racism and sexism and a variety of things that we work hard as educators to not just educate ourselves, but to ensure that the knowledge that we're sharing is coming through a lens that we're being non-paternalistic and confident that we understand the historical context for what we're doing. And so with that, we'll go ahead and get started with the presentation. Francisco, if you can give me access to share my screen, we'll be all ready to go. And so when we talk about anti-bias programming, many people focus on the concept of, looking at an opportunity to participate, but not necessarily being interested in doing some of the important work that they are supposed to be doing. And what that means is that we have to do our internal work and our external work. So my hope today is that we'll be able to move through these slides and have a wonderful discussion as it relates to anti-bias programming and using history as a foundation for change. We have our wonderful support team here with us. And so questions that you have, you can use the Q&A box to put those questions in. And Francisco is going to support us on answering or asking those questions. And I'll do my best to respond to all the questions that we receive. Don't forget that after this session with us all together, you all will be moving into your concurrent sessions that follow this one. And you should all have those links. Just to note, those of you who are moving to the Early Childhood Education Symposium program, you'll stay right in this room, and that will start directly following this particular presentation. Again, thank you all for being here. I'm Dr. Donald E. Grant Jr. I am the Executive Director of our Center for Community and Social Impact at Pacific Oaks College, and we're excited that you all are participating with us today. And so the first thing I want to talk about, I'm hoping you all can see the slides and hear me perfectly, is the construct of mindfulness. As we move through this anti-bias work, some of the concerns that we have is our relationship to understanding our change. And it's important that we pay attention to this mindfulness technique, which focuses your full attention on the present. I'm going to remind you all of this as we move through the presentation today, because some of the things that we'll be discussing can get a little bit complicated, if you will. Some of the things we're discussing may in fact make us feel a certain kind of way. In order to effectively create change, it's important that we practice mindfulness and we allow our feelings and thoughts to happen and we don't judge them. We allow ourselves to be authentically who we are and we don't judge our thoughts. And so I'm hoping that you guys will join me in practicing a little mindfulness as we move through these slides today in this presentation. One of the major components as it relates to breaking systems of racism and breaking structures of racism is our ability to pay attention to what we call cognitive dissonance. Now, cognitive dissonance is this construct that really activates us when we get challenged information that doesn't necessarily fit with our paradigm. It's a mental conflict where two different beliefs exist at the same time, and you want to dismantle those and break those apart, but sometimes we can't. And so how the mind works is that we either change our behaviors or we change the truth. Again, the result of cognitive dissonance is us changing our behavior or changing the truth. One of the reasons why we're here today is because our president, Jack Pedunton, was very deliberate at making sure we are all aware that as an institution, we will be participating in the dismantling of systems of racism, sexism, classism, and homophobia. And so when we talk about those issues, this concept of cognitive dissonance is really important. How do you attend to new information that you get that may conflict with what you already have? How do you accommodate that knowledge? And those are some of the things we'll be chatting about as we move through this discussion today. So first, I want to open up with this cycles of systemic oppression, because one of the concerns that we have in today's age is that people are misunderstanding the magnitude of oppressive forces that have existed in our world, particularly in our country, for many, many years. And so I'm going to go through this really quickly so that we can all get a really good lens and a view of how these things work from a systemic lens. We're oftentimes seeing this from a lens that is not systemic. And Francisco, I know there's some questions coming in. Don't hesitate to interrupt if we're ready to answer some of those questions in real time that may fit with the slide that's right there. So when we talk about systemic oppression and we're looking at how it works and how it's situated across time, we'll start over here with the misinformation that is generated. And so I'm going to go through a quick discussion as it relates to enslavement of Black people on this land to really set the context, particularly as it relates to the current social justice issues sweeping our globe. And so when we talk about the misinformation that was generated to begin the transatlantic slave trade, we understand that there was a trope of scientific racism that created a dialogue whereby people who were darker skinned were seen as savages, as less than, and people who needed to be conquered. This led to the systemic mistreatment of that group and targeted it such that most of the land that European colonists colonized were all lands of color. When you go to Australia today, it's very white. However, during the times of colonization, the indigenous people were of color. Same with the Caribbean, same with this land. And then after you create this system of mistreatment, you're able to justify that mistreatment through the oppressive forces that you engage in. Many of the colonists utilized the construct of imperialism and Christianity in order to demonstrate and justify this mistreatment. And then the institutions come in and they perpetuate and enforce it. The transatlantic slave trade and the entire system of colonization supported that. Remember, the slave trade just didn't incorporate the buying and selling of enslaved people. It also was coordinated with the strategic colonization of the continent of Africa, which creates the foundation of this institutionalized component. The next step is this internalized dominance, where generations and generations of people who were participating in these events and these institutions began to convince themselves and their progeny that they were in fact dominant over the other groups. And that's a really important note to make. Next comes the internalized oppression, where individuals who are members of the targeted group they begin to experience and believe the messages that are being sent from dominant culture about who they are, and finally society accepts them and legitimizes them. That is an important context to understanding anti-bias programming and how it works and the importance of it. Notice, we're talking about this conversation from a systemic lens, and I'm looking to provide you all with the historical context such that you're able to advance your efforts on creating anti-bias curriculum and anti-bias programming across your entire institution or your entire system that you're working from. One of the important things that we don't oftentimes talk about is the creation of the American education system. Many of you
Dr.
are,
Grant,
yes.
sorry to interrupt. So
No?
an attendee has a question on how can you or we respond to peers or community members that do not believe in systematic racism and support the individual's choice?
That is a wonderful question. Thank you for that, Francisco. And please continue to interrupt for questions that we can weave in throughout the presentation. It's very challenging to fight against those who don't believe in systemic racism. My hope is that through this presentation, you will have built up enough evidence to demonstrate and support what that is and how it works and understand the outcomes of it. And so I'll continuously reference that because that question will be answered throughout the course of this presentation. In fact, systemic racism is one of the major reasons why Louise Derman Sparks developed the whole construct of anti-bias education, which she now refers to as anti-bias programming, to understand the system's influence on that. And so these men have been largely associated with the development of American education systems. Hippocrates, Socrates, Pythagoras, Plato, we can all identify work that has been placed out into the world that has been attributed to them. What we know from the historical record is that those men studied in Egypt very early on and took those tools back to Europe and began to identify them as their own. The archaeological record demonstrates that these particular foundations of liberal arts education, which translates from Greek into education for free people, was founded on the continent of Africa. So here's the first thing. When we talk about breaking systems of racism, we have to begin to talk about this construct of historical revisionism and negationism. What that means is that there has been systems put in place to deliberately hide knowledge and information that doesn't support the dominant culture paradigm. I hope everybody got that. And this image here tells this great story about how many of us were taught about Christopher Columbus. My son happens to go to an amazing independent school here in Los Angeles that utilizes the anti-bias curriculum. In fact, one of the concurrent sessions will be presented by that school. And one of the things that drew me to that school was that they put Christopher Columbus on trial as a 5th grade classroom assignment to actually decolonize the story. Now, when we say decolonize the story, we're looking at what this particular image shows, and we see the truth in that. However, right now, we're not necessarily seeing everybody buy into that, kind of like the question that was just delivered. How do we convince people to understand that systemic racism exists? One of the first components is paying attention to historical revisionism and negationism. I have other examples of this for you here. In this particular textbook, it had 68 factual errors about Mexican Americans, 42 interpretive errors, and 31 omission errors. It referenced Mexican Americans as lazy compared to American workers, and it demonstrated by quote, that Chicanos adopted a revolutionary narrative that opposed Western civilization and wanted to destroy this US society. Anybody familiar with Chicano studies understands that it was a group of Mexican American people who were just fighting for the legitimacy of who they were.
Dr. Grant?
Yet, this textbook presented
Dr. Grant?
Yep, go ahead, Francis.
Sorry.
No.
So an attendee asks, what do you feel is the difference between multicultural versus anti-bias approaches in education?
We'll get right to that in a few minutes. I have a slide that talks about the different models of coexistence in America, and it's important to talk about both of them because they feed together. The unfortunate part is sometimes they're aggregated as synonyms, and they're not, and so we'll talk about that. Here's another example of revisionist history that takes a quote in the textbook and speaks about enslaved people being workers. Here's another one that talks about enslaved people being immigrants and looking for positive attitudes about enslavement. It's important that when we talk about structural racism, that we're able and willing to decolonize the stories, go through our children's textbooks and say, this is not an accurate portrayal. Many of us had history textbooks that displayed, for instance, ancient Egyptians as white people, like Cleopatra when Elizabeth Taylor played her. That's revisionist. That's a major part of the structure of white supremacy and the structure of systemic racism is to contort a story to make it not what it really was. And this is a great quote from James Baldwin that I love to incorporate into presentations like this. If, for example, one managed to change the curriculum in all the schools so that Negroes learn more about themselves and their real contributions to this culture, you would be liberating not only Negroes, you'd be liberating white people who knew nothing about their own history. And the reason is that if you are compelled to lie about one aspect of anybody's history, you must lie about it all. If you have to lie about my role here, if you have to pretend that I hold all that cotton just because I love you, then you have done something to yourself. When we talk about structural racism and systems of racism, it's really important to listen to the history and the archaeological record. So here's that construct when somebody was just asking about the difference between anti-bias curriculum and multicultural curriculum. We're saying that the tenets of anti-bias curriculum are formulated to make everybody see themselves and to make everybody understand how to break systems and cycles of racism. Multicultural education focuses on making sure that we have multiple perspectives in the classroom such that each child sees themselves and is able to engage in those conversations and discussions. And so there's a slight difference, but they oftentimes fall into discussion here when we talk about how America has worked to maintain the coexistence, of different ethnic groups. So assimilation was the first model. When the colonists arrived, and you'll see this picture here in the bottom left, this is a young man who was on his tribal land when he was taken away and sent to a boarding school. And as you see his assimilated picture on the right-hand side, which is just one component of what that assimilation was, because the assimilation took them thousands of miles away from home into boarding schools and didn't allow them to see their parents, forced them to abscond from their native languages and native customs, and that created a great deal of trauma. We're actually still seeing the trauma of forced assimilation on our First Nations brothers and sisters today as a result of all of the statistics that we see surrounding substance abuse, school attrition, and a wide variety of things that are directly correlated to a causal relationship between our nation's history of colonization. Segregation was obviously the time of Jim Crow, where we had separate areas, waiting rooms, restrooms, movie theaters, schools, anything you could think of that maintained the separation of people. Melting pot was the next thing, where we wanted to dump everybody into a pot and assume that we were colorblind and that we weren't going to pay attention to the differences because we were all Americans. That's the stance that's oftentimes taken in France, where it's actually illegal by the federal government to collect data on race and ethnicity because they want everybody to be French. Multiculturalism is where we're directing our efforts to now. And multiculturalism is the construct that says our society is more like a salad. We see the lettuce, we see the tomatoes, we see the olives, we see the onions, we see the croutons, and they are all a part of a collective salad, yet we can still identify the individual qualities and see value in those qualities as a whole. And that's the goal for our current existence here in America. An important question to ask as we talk about history. Francisco, I'll pause right here to see, before we move into this portion of the discussion, to see if there were any questions that were still unanswered. Okay, we'll keep moving along then. And so one of the major questions when we talk about structural racism is the recreation of the story of the white immigrant in America. Now, this is where I'm going to ask you to practice some mindfulness again, because many of us have been trained according to a certain paradigm, and we haven't taken time to really dismantle that and think about what it's meant. It's only been in the last 25 years that white people have been actively in a large group looking to access records and historical ideations about where their ancestors came from. We oftentimes talk about the intergenerational nature and experience of those who have been oppressed, but we don't always talk about the intergenerational experience of those who have occupied the oppressor role. And so when we talk about how white people became a group here in America, it's important to understand that when European immigrants arrived on this land, they were identified according to their nationalistic origin. So when German immigrants arrived in the US in the 1920s and 1890s, they weren't considered white, they were German. When Polish people arrived, they were considered Polish, and they were all sent to live amongst the recently freed, formerly enslaved people. Now, when you talk about colonialism and racism in this entire history, this particular book right here is a great resource that some of you may want to access as it relates. But here are 3 other resources that really get into depth about discovering and describing how the white race in America came to be. Notice what you're feeling right now, what you're experiencing as I am having a discussion about the development of white identity. Many people who might be white on the line may be experiencing some dissonance because the world has curated a story for us to understand. And it's important to note that when people who were historically European immigrants became white, there was a cost to that. As the European immigrants and the impoverished Black people, many of them who were impoverished because they had just been freed from enslavement, began to join together, the descendants of the colonists began to observe this, as did the European immigrants, who learned really quickly that if they threw away little pieces of their culture, they would be invited to send their kids to the nicest schools that the descendants of the colonists were sending their kids to get the better jobs. You begin to see European immigrants shorten their last names in order to be accepted into certain circles, and that had a cost. When we talk about structural racism and people who don't believe it, it's important to understand the history of identity development and how that's been recreated into a story that's not really accurate. And that's a part of how this systemic racism works. When we talk about what we need to do about it, it's really important to follow some critical next steps and understand, first of all, some common language. When we talk about creating anti-racist systems and looking at anti-bias programming, we need to really be on the same page and share a common language. And so, first of all, a stereotype is an internal thought created by our human propensity to be cognitive misers. What that means is that we utilize the least amount of cognitive energy to solve problems just by nature. Many of you have approached the door to exit the door, and you see a door exit device that looks nothing like any doorknob in your house. You don't walk up to that doorknob, that door exit device, and say, wow, I'd really like to be able to get out of this room, but I just don't know how. You manipulate the exit device because you have a box or a schema for door exit devices, even those that don't look like the ones you have at home. We do that for people as well. When I go jogging in the evening, I don't get the luxury of stamping Dr. Grant on my forehead, and I just look like a 200-pound black bald man running down the street. As a result, stereotypes about me beat me, and people cross the street or behave differently in my presence. And so when we talk about stereotypes, it's important to pay attention to the stereotype is an internal thought that leads to an internal feeling that's prejudice. And that prejudice leads to an external behavior that's discrimination. And when that discrimination is placed into a system and is oppressive, it becomes racism or sexism or classism. And what we need to understand is very important, 2 points here. There are no good stereotypes. Now, might there be stereotypes that have a good connotation? Certainly. Let's talk about one. Asian Americans are smart. That's a stereotype that has a positive connotation. Here's the problem. The reason why stereotypes are not all good or not never good is simply because a stereotype creates an image for that entire group. What research demonstrates is that Asian American children are diagnosed with pervasive developmental disorders at a much later age than other groups, meaning that Asian American children with autism are being diagnosed at 7 years old or 6 years old on average compared to 2 and 3 year olds, white kids, and then Black and Latino kids somewhere in the middle of there. Any educational professional knows that a higher degree of access to early prevention and intervention efforts for people with pervasive developmental disorders is huge for the outcomes. So we have this stereotype that prevents families from identifying those particular things really quickly. Another important component is looking at the fact that many Asian Americans have identified that they only learned that they had a learning disorder when they went to college and found out from a college counselor, because the stereotype didn't allow them the space to approach it, or their family the space to approach it. So it's important to understand that. The next question on that slide is, can a person of color be racist? Now this right here, hold your boots. It's going to be challenging for a lot of us to accommodate. People of color can be prejudiced. People of color can discriminate. However, people of color cannot be racist. Now, that is because racism requires a system of power in order to operationalize it. And so I'll give you a quick example, because this is really important for us to understand and differentiate between. Many of you may be familiar with, and we'll kind of cut generations in half here, the Beastie Boys and Eminem, two very prominent white rap groups and rapper of different eras. When these men began to enter the space of hip hop music, many of the people who were Black in hip hop, which was predominantly the race of people who were in the hip hop industry at that time, said, no, you can't come here. You can't rap. This is a Black thing. It was created, in New York, and it's a Black story. People believe that that was this construct of reverse racism, when in reality it was discrimination. And I'll explain to you the reason why. Those groups had the opportunity, because of the structure of white supremacy in our world. And notice, we're not attacking white people in these conversations, we're attacking white privilege. And we want people to really be able to discern between those and practice the mindfulness associated with advancing these discussions. When we talk about their opportunities to advance their music careers, they existed well beyond just those spaces of rap and those production and record companies that were providing that. When we talk about structural racism, we have to be deliberate at explaining the fact that women cannot be sexist, poor people cannot be classist, and people of color cannot be racist. It's a tough pill to swallow, and it's not always easy to explain, but it's something I'd encourage each of you to dig into a little bit further if you don't quite have it before we're done. And maybe some of the other constructs on anti-bias programming will help to support some of that work. So we want to be able to help kids and help ourselves understand the difference between the internal work that we have to do and the external work that we have have to do. Francisco, are there any questions that we might need to attend to while we're at this transition?
Yes, thank you, Dr. Grant. So one attendee mentions Ibram X. Kendi disagrees with the idea that people of color can't be racist despite the power issue between dominant versus non-dominant culture. Would you say by POC can be prejudiced instead?
Yes, POC, people of color, can unequivocally be prejudiced and discriminatory and act in ways that discriminate against other groups of people. But as a result of the lack of access to systemic power en masse, it's not possible for them to employ the systems of racism that disenfranchise. In the same way that a man could try to go and get a job at a cosmetic center, and he may in fact be discriminated against at the MAC counter as he tries to convince people that he's able to sell this product and do all this great work. But because he's a man living in a world where sexism exists, he can get career opportunities in other places, whereas women may be barred totally from that, from anywhere, because of sexism. So it's really important to understand, and it's oftentimes challenging to navigate that question. Is there another question, Francisco?
Yes, several. So the next question is, what about people that are light-skinned/white passing minorities?
That's a great question. So colorism is a really important construct that we want to focus on as well. Thank you for bringing that question into this discussion. Colorism is also a trope of white supremacy, and we see colorism throughout all groups of people of color. In fact, Japanese American women, I believe, are the #1 purchasers of skin bleaching cream in America. And when we talk about colorism, many different cultures say, well, racism didn't exist in my country. And that's oftentimes because the country was homogeneous. When I begin to ask them about colorism, we identify that that's very true. And so when you look at novellas for the Latinx community, you'll be able to see huge differences in the very fair-skinned and blue-eyed Latinx people and the darker-skinned Latinx people and the roles that they get. Many of the darker-skinned people are historically cast inside very subservient, impoverished roles, where all the aristocrats are very fair-skinned Latinx people, oftentimes with flowing blonde weaves and blue eyes, in order, again, to promote this context. And so do people who get the advantage of passing as a result of skin privilege get advantages associated with that? Absolutely. But remember, colorism is an offshoot of white supremacy. Francisco, another one?
Yes. Ibram Kendi in How to Be Anti-Racist says that people of color do have power and can be racist because they are police and judges, whereas Layla F. Saad in her book, Me and White Supremacy, says Black people can't be racist because of the power dynamic. Can you comment?
Yeah, that's why it's such a complicated discussion. So when we talk about power, that first quote really takes it down to a level where the individual's primary identity is no longer their race. And I'll give you another example. So when we talk about sexism, I just made a statement that women can't be sexist because of the power dynamic. But let's talk about women who happen to be mothers in the family court system. We understand that men rarely get equal access to custodial cases in family court. And people would say, oh, that's reverse sexism because the women have the power in that space. Well, that's not reverse sexism, because reverse sexism and reverse racism, those aren't real things. What that is that's an area of maternal privilege that's identified whereby a woman will experience a higher degree of power in that specific domain than she would in the general population or the general world. And that's the example from that first quote that the individual is giving. When you have an individual who is Black, who happens to occupy a position of power, that may allow them to discriminate, but because they still exist in a system where white dominates, they will not be able to en masse create racist policies and practices against white people. It's just not possible because of the level of power. I think that's a very good distinction, though, that we understand that that first quote is talking about a primary role identity that is not of race and is of a powerful position of an individual that just happens to be of color. Francisco, another one?
Yes, regarding a BIPOC not being able to be racist, what about pervasive anti-Black racism in racialized communities with more privileged identities?
If I understand the question correctly, we're talking about the different socioeconomic dynamics intra-racially, and it sounds like the individual is talking about the difference in internalized oppression that people who are of the same race may experience. And so an example might be, you'll hear a Mexican-American say, oh, I would never have a Mexican-American lawyer. I never do that. That's a trope of white oppression. And if we go back to that original slide related to the systems of oppression, I'll go back really quickly. It demonstrates that particular point right there where internalized oppression down here at the bottom becomes a thing. And that's a part of this entire cycle of oppression. When we, as individuals who are a part of the outgroup or the target group, begin to engage in activities that support the supremacy paradigm. And so that's another really important question. And so, Francisco, I'm going to go through a couple more slides and then we'll get to a few more questions. Okay, does that work for you?
Okay, thank you.
Okay, I'll come right back to you in 2 seconds. I just wanted to mention these pieces, the internal work that we have to do to pay attention to those automatic thoughts, prejudices, emotions, our knowledge assessment. And I want you to think about these things as I begin to answer a few more questions. The first thought that comes to mind to you when you see this picture. What about this one? Now, just because you looked at this woman throwing the football and you thought, oh my, that's a surprise, that demonstrates something about our world. Think about when you see this picture. Maybe Abercrombie and Fitch model or Gap model or Nordstrom model perhaps. Well, this young man was arrested because the mall in Minnesota had a rule that you're not allowed to wear a hoodie inside the mall. The hood on a head, depending on whose head it is, can mean two very different things. Another example of how systemic racism works. This picture right here, cute family, just hanging out at the beach or something, probably going to get some food or some lunch. Many of you are jarred when you see this family, however. Homophobia and traditional models of family have become a point of contention, and many of us are not even aware that we're jarred at this image and that the homophobia of the world sits with us. This is why breaking and dismantling these systems is so critical. What this looks like with the external work that we have to do is paying attention to exclusion, silence, discrimination, violence, and rumors. And those are the things that kids might engage in. So Francisco, before we jump into this component, I want to give a deeper dive really quickly on what how the media plays a role in this so we can really see the larger scale. So I'll take a couple more questions though.
Okay. Due to systematic racism, can't it be okay for Blacks to discriminate and have a space for ourselves?
Can you read that one more time, Francisco?
Due to systematic racism, can it be okay for Blacks to discriminate and have a space for ourselves?
If I understand the question correctly, I think, for instance, I attended a historically Black college. And so, yes, Black people can discriminate against other groups and curate environments and spaces for themselves. I also believe that other groups need to do that. When we talk about affinity groups and employee resource groups, lots of organizations now have a space where white people can come together and have conversations to not feel the anxiety of saying the wrong thing or offending somebody. Affinity spaces are really important for people to grow and learn if they're properly facilitated. They can certainly go wrong. So yes, I do believe there's a space where people can have individual time for themselves, and that doesn't mean that they won't discriminate against people. So absolutely.
can you briefly talk about the fact that people of color didn't invent racial categories?
Absolutely. It's important to note that racial categories came as a result of white supremacy's efforts at colonization and imperialism. When we look again, I just gave the history of how European immigrants became white, and that was an identity that was created as a result of the oppressive nature of the colonists. And because that had to happen, in order to maintain systems of oppression, we need categories so that people know whose head they can step on. And so that obviously was created by the non-target group or the dominant group in order to maintain those systems of oppression and speak very clearly to the delineation of each group. And then we just talked about colorism, to the delineation of the intra-racial groups inside that group. So yeah, people of color did not come up with race. Remember, race is not a real construct. It has really real consequences, but it's a socially constructed thing. It's not a biological or scientific thing. The problem is that when we say that, we sometimes minimize the huge consequences that it has. Francisco, another one?
Yes. Can you please explain the difference between internalized racism and oppression?
Yes. So they're really kind of the same thing. And I don't use the term internalized racism because it connotes that an individual who is a member of a marginalized group can be racist. And so I only use the term internalized oppression. And so you have internalized oppression that's juxtaposed to internalized dominance. Internalized dominance is when a man says because of sexism that he's better than women. Internalized oppression is when the woman says, I am not as important as men because of her experience and what she's been told about who she is. And so internalized oppression is the same thing as internalized racism or internalized sexism, but semantically, I don't use those terms because of the power dynamic associated with the term demonstrates to me that that group can't be racist or sexist. Another one, Francisco, or should I move on?
I do. There's one. I think there's some clear dissonance between what several of us read from Kendi's book versus what's being presented here and through Louise Derman Sparks. Can we use this as a teaching moment?
Well, I think so. And I think that there's lots of different perspectives in this space. I'm a researcher and I'm an author. And, when we look at the decolonized lens on how this works, many people are bringing different thoughts into it. I have a whole array of books right here. And even amongst Black authors, I have this book by Cornel West, and I have a book by Skip Henry Louis Gates that may speak differently about these constructs. So it's really important that we take in information and begin to dig in a little bit further. And so, yeah, there are, because it's so complicated, it can be challenging. It can be really challenging. Just to go into context really quickly, I did an analysis of all the Black men and women who won awards from the Oscars for Best Leading Actor and Actress in their roles. And what I wanted to do really quickly was demonstrate how the stereotypes of structural racism are supported through the award systems that we acknowledge. And I know we don't have a lot of time left, but here are all the awards that were, all of the awards won for men, Black men, in the Oscars across the entire time that the Oscars have been awarded. Each of these particular roles supports a negative stereotype about Black men. And if you go to USC Film School, you would learn this in film school about these particular tropes. One of the tropes is what we call the magical Negro. The magical Negro is a trope that says that this individual is only here to support the outcomes of the white protagonist. And we saw Sidney Poitier and Morgan Freeman in these two roles demonstrate that, and they were awarded for it. Whereas in Lilies of the Field, Sidney kind of swooped in, saved the nuns, saved the city, and then swooped out. You never learned about who he was, what he needed, or made him tick. Louis Gossett Jr. and Denzel Washington in these two roles were really shown as hyper-masculine and dangerous Black men. And we had Denzel Washington in Glory playing an enslaved man, and we see this hyper-masculinity play out. Here are the roles for which Black men were nominated, but never awarded. And I want you to see the difference between the two. We have here Denzel Washington, who was nominated for Malcolm X, and we know that Malcolm X was a man who stood for a high degree of insight and power and was resistant to white supremacy. Nominated, but not awarded. We have Will Smith here from Muhammad Ali, another individual who fought for those same exact things that Malcolm X did in a different way, nominated but not awarded. We have Don Cheadle here in Hotel Rwanda, who broke the whole system of colonialism of Rwanda, which resulted in the massacres that he saved hundreds of thousands of people from. Nominated, not awarded. We see the same thing here with Morgan Freeman playing Nelson Mandela, the first Black president of South Africa who dismantled apartheid. Nominated, but not awarded. We see a similar trope with Black women who are nominated and not awarded, and what they are awarded for. I use these examples to help us understand the fact that we need to access our power immediately to dismantle these systems of racism and everything that comes along with them. I'm running out of time, but I wanted to make sure we understood the difference between equality and equity. Understanding that our historical context has said that we've given everybody everything the same. Here, you get the same thing. As you see from the top of this slide, equality is not what the world needs. We need equity. Equality is giving everybody the same thing. Equity is giving people what they need. And that's the difference. So when we talk about children's books and we talk about the fact that there are more inanimate objects that are the main characters of children's books than there are children of color, that's a problem. When we understand that 50% of all children's books has a white protagonist, that's a problem. That means little children of color are not seeing themselves. That's why I always love the Keats books. Keats was a Jewish author who decidedly made sure that Black children were being seen in literature. And here's the key with the Keats books. He didn't write about Black children fighting social justice. He wrote about Black children doing everyday things. On a snowy day, what might you do? And this kid just happens to be Black. When we talk about this particular danger, this is an example of structural racism, maintaining a narrative that doesn't show other people themselves. And we want people to move across this paradigm from actors to allies to accomplices, and that's what anti-bias programming does. It forces people into a space where they're no longer allowed or comfortable just sitting with racism, just sitting with sexism. Now, an ally takes a wonderful poster assigned to the march and marches in support, the women's rally or the Black Lives Matter rally, whatever it may be. But the accomplice is the man who goes into his boss's office and says, you know what? I know that me and Jane do the exact same job, and I know that she makes 25% less than me. I'm willing to take a 10% salary cut to make up for pay equity in our company. That's an accomplice, someone who has, or a co-conspirator, someone who has skin in the game, and that's what we need. That's what anti-bias programming does, is it makes sure that systems are able to curate children and pedagogy that makes them accomplices and not actors or allies, and it moves them along that continuum. And so here's Louise Derman Sparks. An anti-racist person is on a lifelong journey that includes forming new understanding of and ways to live her or his racial identity, and then increasing commitment to and engagement in anti-racist actions. You guys will be moving really soon into your concurrent sessions. These are the 4 principles of anti-bias education that many of you will be talking about and learning about. One of the questions that's going to come up in your groups is, when is the proper age to talk to children about racism? many people believe that ECE is not the right time. And Dr. Krause is really going to dig into that and help you understand that. But I wanted to share this other resource with you. The first R, How Children Learn Race and Racism. This is a great case study that talks about how children learn about racism and helps you understand that children learn as early as 4 years old. They begin behaving in ways that treat people differently based on race. Here's some textbooks and some classroom tools that you all can access to utilize inside your classroom to bring social justice into curriculum. So when we're talking about math and we're talking about science, these resources are able to support you in bringing those lessons to your classroom, still meeting your curriculum requirements, but doing it through another lens. So Francisco, I'm going to leave this up here. This is my new book, everyone. It's available right now as a free PDF. My publisher, Palgrave Macmillan, has allowed it to be a part of their social justice readers, and it really provides a global history of systemic racism in America through a study on Black men in the US, the UK, France, and Canada. And again, it's free through the publisher's website as a PDF right now. I'd encourage you all to get it and share. Francisco, I think I have 3 or 4 minutes left to answer a couple more burning questions that we have in the chat box.
Okay. Can you speak more to what proper facilitation in Infinity Group looks like?
That's a great question. When we talk about facilitation, I'll be very brief. When we talk about group facilitation, there's 2 types of heat. There's constructive heat and destructive heat. One of the major pieces of the success of affinity groups is to be able to create constructive heat such that people are uncomfortable, but they feel safe and they can advance their efforts at learning and growing. The problem is if it's not properly facilitated, it becomes an echo chamber and only supports maladaptive thoughts and becomes destructive heat. So that's what I mean when I talk about they have to be appropriately facilitated.
When children see themselves represented in media, books, etc., how does this affect the development of the self and of the world around them, community, peers, etc.? How does this affect the way they interact with others who are of a different culture?
Oh, that's a great question. And when we talk, so for instance, I have a son, he's 10 years old, and we go, like when he was a little kid, we go into the American Doll store sometimes because there were no action figures that looked like him. So I needed him to understand that the world was in fact making toys and things that really looked like him. When Black Panther, the film, came out, it was like an opening of a new world. And so when we talk about children having images of themselves in books and literature and films and TV and cartoons, those are all critical because the unintended message of omission is showing people that they're not a part of it. Some of you may remember back in the early days when we had the Flintstones and the Jetsons, I never saw a Black person in the Jetsons, which led me to believe subconsciously that Black people didn't have a space in the future. That means something. That meant something to my development. I obviously wasn't able to articulate it as an 8-year-old watching Saturday morning cartoons, but I know it did something. I know it meant something. And so representation is huge, and appropriate representation is even bigger.
Donald, very quickly, I have seen a lot of comments that actually showing, well, first of all, thank you for the work that you did and the presentation. Also saying that we need more time. And I just wanted to let the community know that this is not the only forum that we would have. This is an ongoing. We will be creating a network in Southern California through our Pasadena campus and Northern California through our San Jose campus. This conversation must continue to make the difference, right? So you coming in for these 1 hour, I thank for that, but really let's make the real impact together. So we will be setting 2 hubs, Southern California and Northern California, and I invite you to join the network. Let me pass it back to Dr. Grant.
Thank you so much for that, Dr. Pradhan, for that reminder. And really, everybody, I just really want to encourage you all to continue the work. It's hard, it's challenging. it's hard to bring people along and help them understand the magnitude of the work that needs to be done. But the more you learn, the more you can respond. The more people say to you, well, all lives matter, and you're able to say to them, yes, all lives do matter, but we're behaving in a world in a way that we're not acting like all lives matter, right? You can say when people tell you, well, what about Black on Black crime? We can talk about why those things are racial tropes, and we really have to work hard at that. I hope you all enjoy the next 2 sessions. Those of you who are going to be ECE, please stay right here. Dr. Kraus will be joining us immediately to help facilitate that next session. And those of you who are a part of the other 2 sessions for the parents and for K through 12, you should already have your registration links to be able to log right into those sessions. Is that all accurate, Jack?
Yes.
Okay, and my final note is for those of you who are looking to learn more about Pacific Oaks College, please go to www.pacificoaks.edu to learn more about our programming and our social justice mission that we're advancing all across the country. Thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you for the wonderful questions. And Francisco, thank you for facilitating for us.